For over a century, the Ellsworth estate stood in absolute stillness atop Widow's Hill, a pale, bone-white manor wrapped in frostbitten ivy and colonial decay, staring down at the town of Barrow Creek like an old woman holding a secret in her teeth. No one lived there. No one claimed it. No one knocked. Its silhouette loomed through winter fog and spring pollen alike, a permanent fixture in the town's periphery, mentioned only in passing and always with an involuntary glance toward the hill. It was as if Barrow Creek had agreed, long ago and without words, that the house would be left alone, not abandoned, not condemned, just left. Its windows stared out black and empty, and even the trees seemed to avoid it, their trunks bending subtly away from the foundations. No birds nested on its gutters. No children climbed its fence. The White House simply existed, and that was enough to keep people out. Then, in the spring of 2021, during the controlled demolition of the abandoned Wing C at St. Agnes Asylum, a stone's throw from where the Ellsworth property line ended, a rusted file cabinet was discovered sealed behind a false wall. The crew was meant to clear the space, not investigate it. But one of the younger workers, a man named Cole, pried open the cabinet out of bored curiosity. Inside were brittle patient logs, some illegible, and beneath them, a letter. Its paper was yellowed and strangely damp despite the dry air. The envelope read simply, "For the one who remembers the twins." No one at the demo site understood what it meant. But when the letter was handed to the Historical Society for cataloging, a woman named Helen Weir, the last living relative of a schoolteacher who'd once lived near the Ellsworths, went silent as soon as she read it. She didn't speak for an hour. When she did, all she said was, "It's happening again." The letter wasn't signed, but it was dated November 2, 1894, and it described, in cautious and strangely clinical language, a series of ritual observations conducted by a woman named Matilda Ellsworth in her home on the hill. The writer claimed they had witnessed events no God could justify, and warned that if the cellar was ever unsealed, the eye would know hunger again. The Historical Society archived the letter quietly under restricted access. But within 3 weeks, a local podcast caught wind of it, and what had been a closed case became a wildfire of amateur investigation, digital sleuthing, and inevitable trespassing. Drones captured the first aerial photos of the property since 1978. The images showed strange symbols burned into the dead grass behind the manor, massive rings, interlocking and perfectly symmetrical, as though something had been trying to brand the earth itself. The town issued no official comment. They hadn't needed to. Everyone in Barrow Creek remembered the whispers. Not everyone believed them, but everyone remembered. In the years after the house was boarded up, sometime around 1896, there had been talk of disappearances, mostly children. Nothing confirmed. Nothing proven. One boy went missing from school. Another from the church choir. The records showed nothing unusual. But the people who had lived through that time, those who still dared to speak of it, would often mention how the forest near the Ellsworth property had gone completely silent for an entire season. No birdsong. No insects. Just wind. And when the silence ended, it did so with a kind of violence. Dozens of rabbits, dead and bloodless, arranged in a perfect circle just inside the Ellsworth garden gate. No one touched them. The sheriff resigned 2 days later. When asked why, he said only, "Because the ground breathes when it shouldn't." Still, the town moved on. It had to. The house was boarded. The garden grew weeds. The Ellsworth name was erased from records where possible and redacted where it wasn't. Teachers skipped over the family in local history lessons. Maps labeled Widow's Hill as unincorporated. It was as though the town had decided to cauterize its memory, leaving a blank scar where the Ellsworths had been. But time does not forget. And neither does evil. The letter, whether genuine or not, had opened something. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a curse. Whatever it was, it stirred the air around that house, and people began to feel it. Pets went missing. Mailboxes fell off their hinges overnight. Someone spray-painted, The mouth is still fed on the welcome sign at the edge of town. No one claimed it. No one cleaned it. The town simply got quieter. Barrow Creek had survived the Ellsworths once. At least, that's what people told themselves. But survival is not the same as healing. What had happened on that hill, what had been hidden beneath that White House, had never truly ended. It had only been paused. Like a mouth stitched shut just long enough to gather strength. And now, with the letter read and the name remembered, something inside the Ellsworth manor was beginning to stir once more, not with sound, but with the unbearable silence that always comes first. In 1887, Barrow Creek was a quiet place that believed in appearances, and Matilda Ellsworth understood that better than anyone. She moved through the town like steam on glass, soft, warm, always vanishing before you could question what you'd seen. Her silver hair was always pinned perfectly, her gloves always white. She never raised her voice. She donated weekly to the parish, supplied linens to the sick, and delivered baskets to the widows without waiting for thanks. When she passed, men tipped their hats. Women nodded. Children waved. And no one noticed how the birds stopped singing when she walked by. She hosted winter dinners for the mayor, wrote letters on behalf of the illiterate, and taught needlework to the girls at St. Mary's Orphanage. People said she was too kind to be alone, that the Lord should have blessed her with children. And when she eventually claimed to have given birth to twins, no one asked how a woman her age could have done so. They congratulated her. And moved on. The Ellsworth estate was one of the oldest in Barrow Creek, sitting high on Widow's Hill where the light died fastest. Built of pale stone and whitewashed plank, it glared down at the town like it held a long, silent grudge. People said it was too big for one woman, but Matilda never left it untended. She kept the garden trimmed, the hedges symmetrical, and every window polished to a faultless sheen. Servants came and went, though no one ever spoke with them. Deliveries were left at the edge of the property and disappeared before the driver could look back. Matilda claimed she employed a staff of 12. No names were ever known. No faces remembered. The house was spotless. The ledger was clean. And the law never knocked on her door. Not once. What no one knew, what no one dared imagine, was how carefully Matilda had planned it all. Her kindness was a mask, but not a fragile one. It was a studied performance honed over decades, every gesture rehearsed, every glance calculated to disarm. She didn't hide in shadows. She didn't need to. Evil, when done with enough grace, can stand in full light and still remain unseen. She was not cruel in the ways people understood cruelty. She did not strike or scream. She did not punish. She prepared. And in her mind, preparation was love. The twins were part of that. A culmination. A purpose. Their names were never written down. She called them only the mouth and the eye. Titles she claimed were revealed to her in a vision during a winter illness that nearly took her life. She told no one of this vision. Not even the priest. It was hers alone, and from it, she built her rituals in silence. At the church, she prayed. At home, she performed. On Sundays, she lit candles. On Mondays, she bled doves. The garden, though barren to the eye, was laced with roots that twisted in impossible ways, each marked with symbols scorched into the earth using iron rods she kept hidden beneath her bedroom floor. She was exact in all things, the placement of a bowl, the angle of a cut, the tone of a hum sung through clenched teeth. She claimed no pleasure in the rituals. Only duty. The twins required balance, and she believed herself chosen to keep it. They must never touch the world, she once wrote in a letter no one would read until long after she was gone. But the world must feed them. That is the covenant. Barrow Creek, of course, saw none of this. To them, Matilda was the town's white-haired angel. They never asked to see the twins. She claimed they were delicate, born under the wrong phase, and the doctor had advised total darkness. No one argued. In a town built on silence and pride, Matilda's word was enough. And so the nursery remained locked. The windows shuttered. The laughter never heard. But sometimes, if you pass too close to the hill at dusk, you might catch a flicker behind the glass. A movement too low to be a person, too fast to be furniture. Once, a grocer swore he saw a hand reach out from the attic window, small and gray. He said the fingers didn't move like a child should. He didn't tell anyone for a week. And by then he'd convinced himself he'd imagined it. The town kept smiling. Matilda kept serving. And beneath it all, something in the house pulsed slow and steady, like breath behind a wall, patient and waiting. There were no screams. No crimes. Nothing you could point to and say, here. Here is where it began. Only a woman too kind to question, a house too quiet to enter, and a truth too monstrous for anyone to imagine. The news of the twins arrived in late October, 1887, slipped into conversation like a pleasant surprise, though no one had seen a pregnancy, no doctor had confirmed a birth, and not a single neighbor had heard a sound from the house on Widow's Hill. Matilda Ellsworth mentioned it casually, almost sweetly, during a church tea gathering. 2 boys, she said, adjusting her gloves as if the miracle were mundane. Identical in form, opposite in spirit. The women around her smiled, nodded, clucked their tongues in admiration. No one asked the obvious questions. They wouldn't dare. Matilda was too respected, too composed. And Barrow Creek, like many towns of its time, understood that not all things needed to be spoken aloud, especially when they came from the top of that hill. Still, whispers crept in. The town midwife, a stern old woman who had attended nearly every birth in Barrow Creek for 30 years, admitted, only once, and only in private, that she had never set foot in the Ellsworth house. Not for the twins. Not for anything. When asked if that seemed strange to her, she replied, no. What's strange is that no one else thinks it is. The church never recorded a baptism. The census taker, a nervous man from out of town, visited the manor once and refused to go back. He filed the visit as inconclusive due to illness. When pressed for details, he would say only that something was wrong with the windows. The nursery itself became a phantom. The townspeople spoke of it like one might speak of a locked tomb, not with curiosity, but with avoidance. No visitors were allowed past the parlor. No servant was permitted upstairs. The shutters on the upper floor were nailed shut from the outside. One window had been boarded over entirely, though no repairs had ever been requested. At night, faint noises were reported, a low humming, like a song sung without breath, or the gentle thud of something pacing in circles. Matilda dismissed it all with grace. Children dream loudly, she'd say with a small smile. And mine are particularly imaginative. But no one had seen them. Not once. No photographs. No footprints in the snow. Not even a discarded toy. Only a crib, glimpsed through a half-open door by a delivery boy who swore the sheets inside were stained with something that wasn't blood, but wasn't milk either. In truth, there were no toys. There were no books. The nursery was not a nursery. It was a chamber built for containment, for silence, for ritual. Matilda kept the twins separate by a wall of iron lattice, woven in symbols she had learned from books older than her family name. The boys did not cry. They did not laugh. They stared, constantly, at each other, never blinking, never breaking gaze unless Matilda stood between them. She said they were communicating in ways no one could understand, that sound only confused them. She taught them through movement, through mirrors, through silence. One would rock while the other held still. One would spin and the other would bleed from the nose. She kept notes in a leather-bound journal she hid beneath the floorboards, noting phrases like, "The mouth hungers only when the eye turns away," and "No candle lasts past the 9th breath." The entries were written without emotion, just observations, like a scientist charting an experiment. She never named them. Not once. She believed names anchored souls to the earth, and that the twins were not of this earth to begin with. To name them would be to bind them, and she feared what they might become if they were ever bound. So she called them only what they were, the mouth and the eye. The rest of the town assumed the boys were sickly, perhaps disfigured. One woman suggested they had no mouths at all. Another claimed their faces were so identical it hurt to look at them. A few brave children dared each other to climb the hill and peek through the cracks in the shutters, but none ever did. Something about the house repelled them. Even the bravest turned back before reaching the gate, overcome with nausea or headaches, or a sudden nosebleed that made their mothers whisper the old stories again. Over time, the talk of the twins became less frequent. Not because the town forgot, but because remembering them seemed to summon something heavy, a pressure in the chest, a stillness in the air. Matilda continued her charity work. She visited the church, brought candles, smiled. But her visits became shorter. Her gaze, once warm, became distant. Her gloves darkened. Her hair, though always neatly pinned, began to turn brittle at the ends. People said motherhood was exhausting. They didn't know what she was raising. The stories began, as most warnings do, with children. Barely old enough to explain what they'd felt, but old enough to know it wasn't right. They played near Widow's Hill in secret, daring each other to go just a little farther up the gravel path before running back to the safety of the tree line. They told stories, of course. All towns do. They said the Ellsworth house breathed through the chimney at night. They said if you listened close enough to the stone well behind the garden, you could hear babies crying, not normal crying, but the kind that sounded like it came through water, gurgled and desperate. Adults dismissed it as foolishness, chalking it up to imagination and boredom. And so the children stopped telling the adults. But they kept listening. The first boy to say something real was Samuel Ridley. 9 years old, soft-spoken, prone to nosebleeds. He told his older sister that he had heard a voice, not crying but whispering, coming from beneath the Ellsworth cellar. He'd crouched near the side of the house to fetch a ball and had heard something that sounded like a child asking for help. But the voice didn't echo like it should have. It was flat, dull, like someone speaking into cloth. He said the voice knew his name. His sister told their mother. Their mother said nothing. But she did forbid Samuel from going near the hill again. Not because she believed the story, but because she'd heard the same voice once, 30 years earlier, when she herself was a child. And she had spent every year since pretending it never happened. The children of Barrow Creek knew better than to talk too loud about the Ellsworth house. Some knew it instinctively. Others had been warned by grandparents who remembered the early years, when the garden was still fed and the shutters had not yet been nailed down. But even so, children are curious. And children forget fear in daylight. So on warm afternoons, they crept back toward the hill. They would lie flat in the grass and press their ears to the ground, swearing they could feel vibrations beneath the soil. Not footsteps, something slower. Like breathing. Or turning. Sometimes, one of them would hear crying again, muffled, like a hand pressed hard over a mouth. They never stayed long. Then came the chimney sweep. April of 1890. His name was Ellis. 17. Contracted from another town. He was sent up the hill to clean the flue and inspect the brickwork. The Ellsworths had paid in advance. Matilda's neat cursive, signed with a symbol where her name should have been. He arrived in the early morning and was never seen again. The man who drove him up said he left him at the front gate and returned 2 hours later to find no sign of him. The ladder had been moved. The chimney brush lay on the porch, bristles stained with something dark and waxy. The driver knocked. No answer. He waited, then left. He reported the disappearance that evening, but the sheriff made only a single visit. Matilda told him Ellis had never arrived. She invited him inside. He declined. He left shortly after and never filed a report. 3 months later, he left the county altogether. His replacement didn't ask why. He didn't need to. By summer, the whispers had grown. Children refused to walk within sight of the house. Dogs stopped barking at the property line. They simply whined and lay down. A local boy fell into seizures after climbing the garden gate. The doctor said it was heat stroke. The priest said nothing. But he did begin leaving bread at the edge of the Ellsworth fence, Not in blessing, but in barter. Something in the town had shifted. The wind no longer blew through Widow's Hill. It circled it, like a slow, cautious orbit. Later that year, a groundskeeper tending the overgrown cemetery near the base of the hill claimed to hear singing from the Ellsworth cellar. It was low, rhythmic, in a language he didn't recognize. But what haunted him wasn't the sound, it was the way the earth vibrated with it. Like the house was humming back. He left town within the week. No one took his place. The grass grew tall. The graves sank. The dead, at least, seemed undisturbed. The cellar door itself was rarely seen. Tucked beneath the western side of the house, half covered in thorns and creeping ivy, it was locked with 3 separate mechanisms: iron, brass, and something the blacksmith claimed was made of bone. Matilda kept the keys on a chain around her neck, always tucked beneath her dress. She claimed it was a family heirloom. When asked why she wore it so close, she smiled and said, "Because it reminds them to stay asleep." No one knew what she meant, but no one asked her again. Still, something was waking. The crying from beneath the hill grew sharper, closer. People began to hear it in their homes, only faintly, only at night. Mothers held their children tighter. Fathers prayed without words. The town held its breath. And Widow's Hill, silent for so long, began to whisper again. It was not until 1924 that the journal surfaced, bound in cracked red leather, sealed with a silver clasp, and found beneath the floorboards of what had once been Matilda Ellsworth's private dressing chamber. The manor had been untouched for decades by then, locked in probate limbo and thick with the stench of time and rot. A team of preservationists, contracted by the state for inventory and cataloging, had begun the slow work of peeling back the layers of the estate. They were instructed not to speculate, only to record. But one of them, a woman named Janice Moore, found the journal wedged behind a broken floor joist, wrapped in a child's burial shroud. The cloth was stained with yellowed wax. The clasp, though tarnished, opened easily. The entries were written in Matilda's hand, calm and deliberate, as if documenting a recipe or an accounting ledger. The first page simply read, "Feeding records begin on All Souls' Day." What followed was a series of dates, initials, measurements, and strange diagrams, human silhouettes marked with circles at the mouth, throat, and stomach. Beneath them were sentences that grew more unhinged with each entry. The mouth gapes when starved. It must be taught stillness. Salt before wax, else the spirit slips loose. They must not speak. They must never speak. The mouth listens through the skin. Over the next 30 pages, Matilda described a ritual she called the mouthless feast, a grotesque offering meant not to kill, but to silence. She believed that once a year, during the waning crescent moon nearest All Souls' Day, the twin she referred to as the one who shouldn't speak required a sacrifice, not of life, but of voice. According to her writing, the act was meant to quiet the entity, to lull it into another year of dormancy. The process was not sudden. It was methodical. Chosen victims, always children, always alone, were taken into the cellar, stripped of clothing and identity, and prepared for the feast. Their mouths were packed with raw salt, meant to draw out the voice stain, as she called it, the soul's residue in the throat. Then came the beeswax, poured hot and slow, sealing the salt inside until the cheeks bulged and the jaw locked tight. Finally, the lips were stitched closed using horsehair dipped in ash. The children were not killed during this process. In fact, Matilda insisted they remain alive throughout it. "Pain is the seal," she wrote. "Fear is the ribbon. Stillness is the gift." The body was then laid in a shallow trough carved into the stone floor beneath the cellar, a space Janice would later discover in a collapsed section of the manor's foundation. It was no larger than a crib, but stained black with something that had seeped into the stone. Matilda described how the child was to be left for exactly 9 hours, never more. The mouth would come to feed, not on flesh, but on the echo of the voice that could no longer be used. The child would either die of shock or survive, broken and mute. If they survived, They were to be given over to the woods with their eyes covered. Matilda believed the trees knew what to do with them. The town, of course, knew nothing of this. They saw her in the market, selecting pears. They heard her in the church, humming hymns. They did not see the blood under her nails, the wax on her sleeves, the small, stiff shoes buried beneath the garden. But something in Barrow Creek had always felt wrong in late autumn. A cold that didn't belong. A quiet too deep. Some mothers claimed their children stopped speaking altogether for a few days each November, without reason, without illness. The doctors blamed seasonal melancholia. But the children said nothing. Not until it passed. In the journal's final section, Matilda included a list, no heading, no context. Just initials, dates, and brief notes. C'est too loud. Woke the eye. Expired too early. Mouth not full. Though, resisted. Required burning first. There were 19 entries. 19 initials. All matched the names of children reported missing between 1888 and 1895. None were ever found. Most of the reports had been dismissed or misplaced. 2 of them had never even made it into official records. Janice's team verified each one using old-school rolls and orphanage ledgers, but the authorities dismissed it as historical coincidence. The journal, they said, was the delusion of a grieving woman, a work of disturbed fiction. The state shelved the discovery, sealed the evidence, and declared the case closed. But Janice knew better. She hadn't told them about the wax, or the stitch kits, or the bones with sewn lips she found buried behind the collapsed cellar wall, mouths still packed with salt that had turned gray and dry. The smell was unbearable. The silence worse. She burned the journal weeks later. But sometimes, in the early hours before waking, she swore she heard chewing behind the walls. And always, it came after silence, the kind that presses in, too complete, too heavy to be natural. Barrow Creek never learned the full truth. The cellar was filled in. The well capped with stone. The ground receded. But something still gnaws at the roots. Every year, as the leaves begin to fall, the town feels it again. The cold, the hush, the waiting. And some still whisper of the mouthless feast, of the stitched lips and the wax. Not out loud. Not during the day. Only in dreams, or when the wind turns wrong. Because deep down they know, something that feeds on silence doesn't die. It only waits to be fed again. There was something strange about the Ellsworth garden. For decades, it stood at the crest of Widow's Hill, perfectly symmetrical, endlessly tidy, rows of green that never seemed to change, even as seasons rolled past. The soil was always dark. The beds were always mulched. But no one ever saw a sprout break the surface, no fruit, no harvest, no scent of vegetables in the air. The townsfolk told themselves it was ornamental, a private pleasure for a woman who had lost much. But even ornamentals bloom. Even roses decay. The Ellsworth garden remained untouched by both. It was too perfect, too quiet. And if you stood close enough on a windless day, you might notice that the air around it was colder than it should have been. Not icy, hollow. Like breath that had been stolen from something and buried deep beneath the surface. Despite this, the Ellsworths never bought food. The grocers, the butchers, the produce wagons, none ever made regular deliveries to the manor. And yet Matilda fed her staff, her guests, her supposed children. She even donated baskets of bread and root vegetables to the parish in the colder months. A quiet unease began to grow. The food came from nowhere. The garden bore nothing. And when pressed, Matilda only said, "The earth provides when the dead are patient." It sounded poetic, even harmless. But those words would take on a far darker meaning once the house was opened and the garden was dug. In 1931, after the estate passed through the hands of distant legal heirs with no interest in claiming it, a team was hired to clear the property for public auction. Workers began by leveling the garden, which had become overgrown and brittle, but not in any natural way. The soil resisted tools. roots pulled back as if avoiding the light. And after only a few feet of digging, a worker named Clark uncovered a hidden trapdoor, half-rotted and camouflaged with ash-laced mulch. The hinges were sealed with resin. It took nearly an hour to pry them open. The door groaned like something exhaling after a long silence. What lay beneath was not a garden cellar, not a storm shelter, not even a room meant for the living. It was a vault, cold, stone-lined, and lined with shelves from floor to ceiling. Each shelf stacked tight with thick glass jars. Inside the jars, tongues, preserved in a thick, milky brine. Hundreds of them. Some small, others wide. Each suspended like soft fruit in syrup, curling slightly, edges frayed as if torn or cut in panic. Most were intact. Some had teeth still embedded. Others had been pierced with iron pins, threaded through the root and twisted into shapes no tongue should hold. But it was the labels that chilled the air. Each jar had a name. Some faded, some etched in the glass itself. Many of the names matched those from Matilda's journal, the children taken for the mouthless feast. Others matched gravestones in Barrow Creek. Some didn't match anything at all. Foreign names. Strange spellings. One simply read, mine. Another, yours. The handwriting was Matilda's. There were notes, fragments of entries tucked into crevices, written on curled vellum that had hardened with age. Tongues hold breath. Breath holds memory. The mouth does not feed on flesh, but on the weight of unspoken truth. Another, cut at the root. Do not let them scream. They carry it in their throats. One jar was larger than the rest, filled with several tongues bound together by wax thread. The label read only, choir. What voice could these have once formed? What song had been silenced? Janice Moore, still the lead on the estate's investigation, documented each jar. But by the third day, 2 of her team had fallen ill, migraines, nosebleeds, vomiting when near the vault. The jars were removed and stored, but strange things followed. One archivist reported hearing wet clicking sounds behind him in the night. Another claimed her own tongue felt thick and bruised every time she catalogued a label. Several lost their voices temporarily. Janice herself would not speak for 3 days after cataloging the choir jar. She said nothing happened, but she wrote a letter to her sister that ended with the line, "I still feel them singing even when I close my mouth." Experts were brought in. The tongues were dated, tested, dismissed. Science called it preservation, pathology, perhaps a misplaced obsession with anatomy. But one forensic linguist noted that several tongues bore ritualistic cuts, not surgical but symbolic. Like they were trying to teach silence, she said. Like someone believed silence could be made. When news of the vault reached Barrow Creek, the town responded in the only way it knew how, with silence. No memorials were made. No names read aloud. The garden was reseeded and paved over. A small sign was placed, historical site, private property. But the memory remained. And some swore that late at night, when the wind cut sharp around the hill, you could still hear the soft hum of voices, not screaming, not crying, but trying to speak, and never managing more than a wet, broken whisper. The earth above the vault has never grown anything since. Barrow Creek Primary stood at the edge of the woods, a plain, one-room schoolhouse with whitewashed boards, a ringing brass bell, and 12 desks worn smooth by restless hands. It was a place of routine, of scripture lessons, arithmetic recitations, and whispered secrets passed under slates. For years, it was the pulse of the town's youth. But between 1888 and 1895, something shifted. 14 children vanished, one by one, and always during school hours. At first, the disappearances were scattered, explainable. A boy wandered into the trees chasing a stray dog. A girl never arrived after walking alone from the eastern farms. The town murmured about wild animals, wolves Mo said, or river gypsies. Stranger things had happened in rougher places. But wolves don't leave shoes. And they don't leave them arranged, in pairs, laces tied, set neatly by the edge of the schoolhouse stairs. They don't leave chalkboards still wet with names half-written. They don't leave packed lunches untouched. They don't leave desks warm. The teachers said little. They were paid little, asked little, expected to endure. Miss Holloway, who taught the younger children, began locking the doors during lessons. She barred the windows with broom handles. Still, the children vanished. Always in silence. Always without warning. One moment there, the next, ups. And somehow, no one saw it happen. After the fifth child, the town began to whisper about the Ellsworths again. The timing was too neat. The dates matched the journal entries found decades later, though no one knew it then. The children were all between 6 and 10, the same age Matilda had once claimed the twins would begin to hunger. But there was no proof. No footprints led to Widow's Hill. No witness placed anyone near the manor. And so the town buried its suspicions under layers of fear and silence. The schoolhouse, however, remembered. On the floorboards beneath the fourth desk in the second row, a carved message was found in 1902 when the school was being closed. She watches through the trees. Don't look at the fence. No one knew who had carved it. The desk had belonged to a boy named Jeremy Long, one of the missing. His shoes had been found tucked beneath his desk, still warm when the teacher noticed he was gone. The ink on his last sentence hadn't even dried. Worse still were the patterns that began to emerge. Each child had shown signs of unusual behavior before they vanished. Whispering to corners. Staring too long at doorways. Saying things like, "She told me not to scream," or, "The mouth gets full if we're quiet enough." One girl was found trembling behind the woodpile days before she vanished, lips sealed with sap and strips of fabric torn from her own hem. She wouldn't speak. She simply pointed toward the woods and shook her head until she passed out. They sent her home with her mother. She was gone the next morning. The town, desperate for scents, called in hunters. They scoured the woods. Traps were laid. Rifles carried. But nothing came of it. One hunter claimed he found a clearing filled with children's socks, all turned inside out, weighed down with smooth stones. He left immediately and never returned. Another spoke of trees that bled from the bark when scratched. No wolves were ever found. But the missing children remained missing. The parents began to keep their children home. The schoolhouse emptied. And the bell, once rung every morning at 8, fell silent for good in the spring of 1896. Years later, when the building was dismantled, more carvings were found beneath the floorboards. Small ones. Initials, dates, strange symbols, circles with slashes, eyes with no pupils, mouths with no teeth. One read simply, "The feast is not just in the cellar." The boards were burned. The ashes scattered. But not all things vanish with fire. Not when fear is older than the flames. Barrow Creek never replaced the school. The children were sent elsewhere or taught at home. Education became something quiet, private, almost shameful. And no one spoke aloud the names of the 14 lost. But their shoes were kept. Stored in the chapel basement, in a locked cabinet beneath a faded painting of Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of the mute. Every few years, someone would open it. Count them. 14 pairs. All laces tied. All waiting. None ever dusty. In a town as small and superstitious as Barrow Creek, time has a peculiar way of folding in on itself. Memories are carried not in newspapers or archives, but in the wrinkles of old hands and the trembling voices of those too tired to lie. That's why, when a man calling himself Dr. Percival Voss applied for residency privileges at the county infirmary in 1912, the old women at the general store recognized his face, even if they dared not say so aloud. He was the same man, they whispered behind drawn curtains, who had arrived in Barrow Creek nearly 3 decades earlier, in the autumn of 1886. Same name. Same eyes. Same unsettling quiet. Only back then, he had been a traveling physician, unlicensed but educated, with a fine leather bag and a way of appearing only when he was most needed. or least expected. There were no photographs from 1886. Only a portrait, oil on canvas, painted by Matilda Ellsworth herself. It hung in the hallway leading to her private study, visible only when the candlelight flickered just right. In it, the doctor sits straight-backed in a red velvet chair, hands gloved, face calm, ageless. His features are symmetrical in the way that statues are, not people. Too precise. Too preserved. But the painting from Matilda's estate and the formal staff photo from 1912 tell the same story. The man had not changed. Not his face, not his build, not the deliberate stillness in his eyes. In a town where years left deep marks, Dr. Voss had none. He made house calls only after dusk, always arriving in a black trap pulled by an aging gray mare. No one in Barrow Creek ever claimed to have heard the sound of his arrival. No hoofbeats. No wheels. Just a sudden awareness that the cart was waiting, that the air had gone colder, and that the doctor had already entered whatever home he intended to visit. He never brought an assistant. He never asked for payment. And he visited only one address with regularity, the Ellsworth Manor. Every fourth Monday, between 1886 and 1895, neighbors reported seeing a dim lantern glow on the path to Widow's Hill, followed by the brief flicker of movement through the upper windows of the house. Then nothing. No smoke. No sound. No horses tied. The visits continued long after the supposed birth of the Ellsworth twins, and long after the town stopped believing those children were ever truly alive in the ordinary sense. Rumors swirled. Some said he was a surgeon sent from Boston to treat deformities too grotesque for public view. Others whispered of a spiritualist, a man who trafficked in liminal spaces, someone who knew how to bind things to silence. The truth, of course, was harder to speak, because even in whispers, no one dared accuse a man like Voss of feeding something that shouldn't be kept alive. His records at the infirmary were sparse. He wrote with brevity and precision. No emotion. No speculation. Only observations. Breath shallow. Vessel stable. Speech suppressed. Effectiveness uncertain. No names. No patient identifiers. Only initials. Often repeated. In one margin he scribbled, W.S., new tongue rejected. Screamed. Procedure failed. That same week, a child from the outskirts of town vanished while walking home from church. Her name was Winifred Sinclair, and then, as suddenly as he had arrived, he was gone. After 1916, no further documents list Dr. Voss in Barrow Creek. No obituary. No transfer. No resignation. His office was cleared in silence. His cart abandoned behind the infirmary, wheels sunk into the soil. The mare was never seen again. The local paper didn't mention his departure. But a nurse, decades later, recalled something strange. During his final week, she swore she saw him sitting alone in the morgue, speaking softly into a glass jar filled with what looked like honey. She left without asking questions. The next morning, the jar was gone. Years after the manor was abandoned, a hidden chamber was discovered beneath what had once been the Ellsworths' library. Inside, 3 things were found: Matilda's painting of Dr. Voss, now cracked down the center, a worn medical ledger signed with his name, though the ink never faded, and a metal tray holding 6 sets of human vocal cords, dried and preserved, each tagged with a date and a brief note. One read, Twin A returned. Another, Twin B resistant. And below them all, a final scrap of paper with a single sentence written in that same sharp hand: the body decays. The voice does not. Some truths must be swallowed whole. What kind of physician keeps time by the silencing of others? What kind of man does not age, but arrives always when silence is breaking? Dr. Voss was never proven to exist outside Barrow Creek. No census records. No school logs. Only town registers and one surviving photograph. But the Ellsworth Journal refers to him by name over a dozen times. Sometimes as the Keeper of Throats. Sometimes only as P. Some believe he was never a man at all. only a shadow in a well-fitted coat. A mouth that never opened, and hands that knew how to stop other mouths from ever opening again. It was by accident that the attic was discovered. In 2021, over a century after the Ellsworth Manor was shuttered and sealed, a local historical trust began a full architectural survey to determine whether the home could be stabilized for public heritage access. The manor had always been known to hide secrets behind its walls: false panels, locked doors without keys, rooms walled off for no reason anyone living could recall. But this attic, concealed behind a sealed archway above the west stairwell, had never appeared on any blueprint, not even the original plans filed by the county clerk in 1874. It was found only when a preservationist's tool slipped through a warped bit of plaster, revealing brick, and then an iron latch, rusted shut for 134 years. Behind the door was a single, windowless room with a vaulted ceiling and no furnishings. Every wall, including the floor and the inside of the sloped ceiling, was covered in mirrors. Not just hung, built in. Dozens of them, paneled and sealed with heavy framing, each warped slightly with age and pressure. They faced one another in infinite reflection, reflections that felt wrong even in stillness, angles that distorted, mirrored movements a fraction of a second too slow or too fast. The preservationists were professionals, trained to document, not dramatize. But several of them reported an immediate, visceral unease. One said he felt his heart race without cause. Another fainted the moment she stepped inside. It wasn't the mirrors themselves that frightened them at first. It was what was behind them. When one panel cracked under pressure from a sagging beam, they pulled it loose, expecting to find wall studs or plaster. Instead, they found etchings. Dozens of them. Initials carved into the boards behind the mirrors. Some crude, some careful. All faint but readable. They matched the names of 19 children, every one of them tied to Barrow Creeks missing between 1888 and 1895. Each set of initials was accompanied by a date and a crude symbol. An open mouth, an eye crossed out, or worst of all, a perfect circle, completely empty. Some mirrors bore more than one set of initials, layered on top of one another as if re-etched over time. And beneath several of them were long, thin scratches. Not from tools. From teeth. Bite marks. Human. Shallow but unmistakable. The glass had been chewed, not shattered, not broken, but gnawed. As if something inside had tried to escape, not through the room, but through its own reflection. Forensics later confirmed it. The bite patterns matched human children, some as young as 6. One mirror had a child's tooth embedded in its edge, roots still intact, worn smooth from age. But no blood was ever found. No signs of a struggle. Only the eerie stillness, the countless reflections, and the marks of teeth, of hands, of fingernails scratching out names and begging for memory. Matilda's journal, long believed to be incomplete, included only a single reference to the attic. They scream when they see themselves. But they quiet if you hold them long enough. The glass keeps the voice inside. She called the space the reflection room. She believed it was a place where the voice could be taught stillness, not just the mouth. That children who resisted the mouthless feast could be placed there, made to confront the sound of themselves until it was no longer part of them, until they forgot how to speak. But something else had happened there. Something worse. Later entries from her journal, found stuffed into a broken floorboard beside the reflection room's entrance, described what she called echo walkers. Children who returned from the mirror not quite themselves. Children who mimicked speech without understanding. Who laughed in the wrong places. Who stared too long, even at their own hands, as though unfamiliar with the skin. One entry read, "Twins vanished in glass again." Only one returned. Others stayed to feed. Experts debated what the room had been used for. A failed sensory therapy chamber, perhaps. A perverse psychological experiment. But none could explain the absence of windows. The lack of hinges on the inside of the door. The double layer of iron locking mechanisms. or the fact that none of the mirrors showed their own reflections clearly unless the viewer stood completely still. Several members of the team that entered the room refused to return. One developed severe glossophobia, the fear of speaking aloud. Another, a young technician named Milo, began experiencing night terrors in which his mouth filled with broken glass and he could not cry out. His final written note before he was hospitalized simply read, "I don't think the mirrors stopped watching. I think they just stopped being watched." The reflection room has since been resealed, this time with industrial concrete and steel plating. No official record of its contents has been released by the Barrow Creek Historical Trust. But photographs from that day still circulate on quiet forums and dark corners of the internet. Blurry, dim images. Mostly just walls of glass. But in one, taken just before the cracked mirror was removed, something faint appears. Not a child, not a person, but a silhouette, almost human, standing just behind the reflection of the preservationist's shoulder. Its mouth is wide open. Its eyes are gone. And on the inside of the mirror, though no one was inside the room at the time, teeth marks appear, fresh, sharp, and wet with something red. Some say the mirrors were never meant to reflect, only to contain. The fire came suddenly, without warning, and without mercy. It tore through the ruins of the Ellsworth Manor like a beast unleashed, devouring decades of dust, memories, and secrets. The townsfolk, long resigned to the manor's dark reputation, watched from a distance as flames consumed what was left of the once proud estate perched on Widow's Hill. But amid the collapse and smoke, something unexpected was found: a charred, partially burned book, Matilda Ellsworth's final ledger. Its pages were fragile, scorched black at the edges, but its contents were unmistakable, a meticulous record of every ritual completed, every secret act committed behind closed doors, and every soul swallowed by silence. This ledger was unlike any other document discovered in the Ellsworth archives. It was not simply a list of names or dates. It was a chilling confession, written not in sorrow or regret, but in the cold precision of a scholar cataloging her research. Each entry described a ritual designed not to harm the body, but to feed something darker, something unseen. It named the twins as the mouth and the eye, and made a claim that sent chills through anyone who read it. These children were not born of flesh and blood. They were entities born from fear itself. They did not consume flesh, the ledger said, but thrived on terror, on the silence forced upon their victims. The ledger described how these children were nurtured through ritualistic ceremonies, designed to amplify fear in their environment until it became a tangible force. The mouth, the ledger noted, was insatiable. Its hunger could only be sated by swallowing voices, swallowing screams, until its hunger echoed through the house's hollow walls like a growl beneath the floorboards. The eye was different. It did not need to consume sound. It fed on sight, on watching, on the slow decay of hope as its victims realized they were never truly alone. Each ritual, detailed with a terrifying calm, involved the gradual stripping away of the victim's senses and identities. The ledger described the mouthless feast in haunting detail, the forced ingestion of beeswax and salt to silence those who might cry out. It told of children bound in the reflection room, where mirrors trapped more than just their reflections. They trapped their voices and their souls. There were references to the jars in the garden's root cellar, filled with preserved tongues, souvenirs of the mouth's growing appetite. The ledger's most disturbing entries spoke of the twins' nature as more than children, entities born from a dark pact, tethered to the manor and its horrors. Matilda wrote of moments when the twins vanished into shadows, slipping between worlds, their presence felt only in the sharp chill of an empty room or the faint whisper of a voice no one else could hear. The ledger claimed that these rituals were designed to keep the twins bound, to prevent them from feeding on the town's living souls, yet it suggested that each ritual only made their hunger deeper, their existence more desperate. Matilda's handwriting grew erratic near the end, the ink blotting and letters twisting as if written by a hand trembling with fear or madness. She described a final ritual she called the Binding of Silence, intended to end the twins' torment by sacrificing her own voice, offering herself as the ultimate silence. But the ledger ended abruptly, the last page torn and burned beyond recognition. Historians and experts who studied the ledger agreed on one thing: Matilda Ellsworth was not a mother in the usual sense. She was a guardian, a prisoner, and a participant in a darkness so vast it defied comprehension. The ledger suggested that the twins were never truly human, and perhaps never intended to be. They were shadows given shape, entities born from fear and sustained by the silence of a town too frightened to speak their names aloud. The fire that revealed the ledger also destroyed much of the manor's last physical traces, erasing the home that had harbored such horrors. Yet the ledger survived, fragile, haunting, a final testament to a nightmare long buried. It confirmed what the town had suspected but never dared to voice. The Ellsworth legacy was not one of ordinary cruelty, but of a ritualistic, supernatural hunger that consumed everything it touched. The twins were not just children to be hidden, they were monsters fed by silence, creatures that thrived in the shadows of fear and secrecy. The legacy of the Ellsworths has since cast a long shadow over Barrow Creek. In the decades after the fire, new laws were enacted about child welfare and institutional oversight. The manor's ruins were turned into a memorial, not to honor the family, but to remind the town of the darkness that once lived among them. Confessions and testimonies once sealed in locked vaults were finally unsealed, shedding light on the silence that allowed evil to flourish. In the end, the ledger leaves a grim reflection. Evil often wears a mask of normalcy and quietness. It does not shout. It does not demand attention. It waits patiently, feeding on fear, thriving in the spaces where no one dares to look. Matilda Ellsworth's story is a chilling reminder that some horrors hide not in shadows but behind the softest, kindest eyes, and that silence, when chosen over truth, can be the most terrible ritual of all. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could the silence of a town give birth to monsters hidden in plain sight? The answers linger, just beyond the edge of reflection. When the Ellsworth estate finally came down, it was not with the fanfare of history celebrated, but with the hush of a town eager to bury its darkest past beneath rubble and dust. Bulldozers tore into the crumbling walls, the sagging roof, the once grand facade that had watched over Barrow Creek for more than a century. Neighbors gathered at a cautious distance, eyes averted from the rotting beams and shattered glass, unwilling to look too closely at the ruins of a place where so many voices had been silenced. The demolition was a collective exhale, an attempt to wipe clean the stain of memory that the manor had become. But beneath the cracked foundation, beneath the shattered floorboards and layers of earth, something far worse than broken wood and shattered glass was discovered. Human bones. Arranged deliberately in perfect circles, dozens of them, etched deeply into the soil like cryptic glyphs from an ancient text. Each circle was carefully formed, no random scatter, no careless heap. Inside those circles lay skulls, their jaws pried open unnaturally wide, and within each mouth rested a small, shining silver key. The keys glinted coldly in the harsh light of the morning sun, their metal dulled only by the decades they had slept beneath the dirt. No doors. No locks. No explanation for what these keys were meant to open. Archaeologists and forensic experts pored over the site, their faces pale beneath layers of dust. None could say what doors the keys belonged to, only that the placement was deliberate, an eerie, ritualistic act, as if the dead themselves were meant to guard secrets no one alive should find. Some speculated the keys symbolized voices trapped behind locked doors, silent forever. Others whispered about doors that should never be opened, thresholds between worlds, sealed by the weight of fear and the sacrifice of innocence. The bones were carbon dated to roughly the same period as the Ellsworth disappearances, the missing children, the vanished twins. Teeth were missing, broken, or filed down, just like the bite marks found in the reflection room mirrors. The patterns suggested a ritual both macabre and methodical, A careful arrangement, a final message or warning carved into the earth in bone and metal. The fact that the bones formed circles, a symbol of eternity, of cycles unbroken, only deepened the mystery. What did the Ellsworths intend? What doors remained locked, even in death? The town of Barrow Creek did not speak openly about the discovery. Official statements were brief, clinical, and quickly forgotten by the media. But behind closed doors, a deep unease settled among the older families. Some whispered that the manor's destruction had awakened something. Others swore they heard faint knocking at the edge of dreams, or the cold brush of invisible fingers when the night was still. The bones beneath the ground became a silent reminder that some secrets never die, no matter how thoroughly they are buried. To contain the unease, the town council commissioned a memorial. It was modest, a circle of stone benches arranged around a single granite pillar, etched simply with the names of the lost children and the dates they vanished. No mention of the twins. No hint of the dark rituals or the mouthless feast. The memorial was meant to honor absence, to remember what had been taken, but never to explain why. Visitors often remarked on the oppressive silence that hung over the memorial, the way shadows seemed longer there, the way the wind carried faint whispers only half heard. Locals avoided the site after dusk, speaking in low tones about the Ellsworth curse, but refusing to tell stories openly. The silence was intentional, a pact to forget or to never know too much. It was as if the town itself still feared awakening the mouth or the eye. Behind that silence lies the true legacy of the Ellsworths, the knowledge that some evils are so carefully hidden, so methodically nurtured, that even in death, their presence lingers. They leave behind not only bones and keys but a silence so profound it becomes a shield against truth. A silence that feeds monsters, real or imagined, and demands a price for speaking out. What was locked away by those silver keys? What doors remain unopened in the shadows beneath Barrow Creek? No one alive can say. But the arrangement of those bones, the ritual of their placement, suggests the Ellsworths believed some doors should stay closed forever. Some voices should never be heard. The memorial stands as a quiet testament, not just to loss, but to the weight of silence. And that silence, above all, is the inheritance the town must carry. Barrow Creek was never quite the same after the Ellsworth secrets unraveled. The once quiet town, nestled in the folds of Vermont's hills, carried an invisible scar, a wound stitched over by fear and silence but never truly healed. In the years that followed the estate's destruction and the grim discoveries beneath its soil, change came in small but significant measures. The state legislature passed a law requiring postnatal checks within 48 hours of every birth, an effort to prevent another story like the Ellsworth twins from slipping through the cracks unnoticed. It was a law born of guilt and fear, an attempt to guard against shadows that hide behind innocence, behind kind eyes, behind normal faces. Mothers and children were to be accounted for, their lives documented, their presence no longer allowed to vanish into the mist of forgotten places. But even as laws were written and hospitals enforced new rules, the Ellsworth case remained an enigma cloaked in silence. Official records of the family's darkest deeds were sealed away under a religious exemption, protected by promises of privacy and sanctity that no one dared to challenge openly. It was as if the town, state, and church together chose to bury the evil deeper, to lock away the horror behind layers of faith and law, hoping that the darkness would not return if left unspoken. The secrecy that once allowed the twins and their terrible rituals to flourish now continued to protect their memory, hiding it behind thick walls of institutional silence. This silence, the townsfolk would come to understand, was the true legacy the Ellsworths left behind. Evil, they learned, does not always scream. It does not always clamor for attention. Often it whispers. It moves quietly, patiently, in the spaces no one looks, feeding on the gaps in knowledge, the unasked questions, the secrets that everyone pretends don't exist. It wears the mask of normalcy, Matilda's gentle eyes, the charitable smiles, the tidy estate on Widow's Hill, and waits. It finds its strength in silence, in the fear of speaking out, in the small betrayals of turning away. Barrow Creek's older residents still remember the warnings whispered in dark corners, the uneasy glances toward empty rooms and locked doors. They remember children who vanished and were never spoken of again, the faint cries heard from a cellar that no one dared investigate. They carry the knowledge that beneath the surface of everyday life lies a darkness that can never be fully erased, only contained for a time. They understand that silence is not peace, it is a prison. Even today, some say you can feel the twins' presence in the chill of a sudden draft, or in the way reflections sometimes distort in mirrors, showing something not quite human. The mouth and the eye, entities born of fear, fed by silence, still linger in the edges of the town's collective memory. Their hunger was never truly satisfied, only deferred, as long as the town keeps its secrets locked tight. The question remains, how long can silence hold back a monster? In the end, the story of the Ellsworths is a warning, a grim lesson on how evil can hide behind normal faces, how it thrives where fear silences truth, and how darkness does not always demand to be seen. Sometimes it simply waits for a crack in the silence, a lapse in vigilance, a town willing to forget. The legacy of Barrow Creek is not just in the bones beneath the ground or the keys in silent mouths, but in the chilling understanding that evil is not always loud or obvious. It is patient, methodical, and above all, quiet. What do you think? Could such evil exist quietly among us today? Could silence be the greatest danger of all?